In 2026, the United States is spending billions defending against Iranian missiles. Every interceptor costs between $1 and $3 million. The defense budget exceeds $800 billion annually, and the national debt stands at $33 trillion. Meanwhile, Iran, under sanctions for 40 years, keeps fighting, the weapons keep launching, the infrastructure keeps functioning. And the question everyone is asking is how? How does a sanctioned economy sustain a war against the wealthiest military on earth? The answer isn't just tactical, it's structural, and the structure traces back 14 centuries to an economic principle most people have never heard of: zakat, a mandatory 2.5% annual wealth tax that Islam hardwired into its financial system, not as charity, as obligation. And that obligation created an economic logic fundamentally different from the debt-driven capitalism financing America's war machine. Here's the mechanic. In Islamic economics, wealth that sits idle is dead. Hoarding is discouraged. Capital must circulate, and zakat enforces circulation by taxing accumulated wealth annually, not income. Wealth: if you hold $100,000 in assets beyond basic needs, you owe $2,500 every year, no exceptions. The money doesn't go to the state, it goes directly to the poor, to education, to infrastructure. It bypasses centralized control, and it prevents concentration. Now think about what that does to an economy over time. Wealth can't compound indefinitely in private hands without leaking back into circulation. The ultra-rich can't exist in the same way they do under capitalism, because 2.5% annually over decades erodes any fortune not actively reinvested in productive use. If you're watching this war and wondering how Iran's resistance economy survives isolation, stay with me. Because the financial logic embedded in zakat is playing out in real time, and it's working in ways capitalism can't replicate. The United States operates on debt. Government borrows, spends, repays with future revenue. That works when growth exceeds interest. But when debt reaches $33 trillion, interest payments alone consume $600 billion per year, and war accelerates the borrowing. Every missile defense system, every carrier deployment, every base expansion, all financed by bonds. The system assumes infinite capacity to borrow, and infinite willingness of creditors to lend. Iran doesn't have that luxury. Sanctions cut it off from international finance. No bonds, no dollar access, no IMF bailouts, so it built a resistance economy, self-sufficiency in key sectors, domestic production, and critically, an economic culture shaped by zakat, where wealth concentration is religiously prohibited, where circulation is mandated, where hoarding is sin. This creates resilience. When wealth circulates, more people have access to capital. Small businesses survive. Local production thrives. The economy doesn't depend on a few ultra-wealthy individuals or corporations. It's decentralized, distributed, and that distribution makes it harder to collapse. You can't sanction an economy where wealth is already spread thin. You can't starve a system that doesn't depend on concentrated capital. Look at the war's financial mechanics. America spends $11 million to $33 million intercepting a single Iranian missile. Iran spends $200,000 building it. The cost asymmetry is devastating, but the deeper asymmetry is structural. America finances war through debt. Iran finances war through internal redistribution. One system borrows from the future. The other redistributes from the present. Zakat enforces present redistribution. Wealth earned this year gets partially redistributed this year. The cycle repeats annually. Over time, this prevents the kind of wealth concentration that defines modern capitalism. Jeff Bezos holds $200 billion under zakat. He'd owe $5 billion annually, not to the state, to the community. That $5 billion doesn't sit in a foundation. It circulates immediately into education, infrastructure, poverty relief. Now imagine scaling that across an entire economy. Wealth still accumulates, but it leaks constantly. And the leakage funds societal resilience, schools, hospitals, water systems, the same infrastructure Iran is defending in 2026. Because when wealth circulates, infrastructure gets built. And when infrastructure exists, war becomes survivable. Contrast that with America's model. Wealth concentrates, billionaires multiply, infrastructure decays. And when war comes, the government borrows to rebuild what private capital never funded in the first place. The irony is brutal. The wealthiest nation on earth has crumbling bridges, failing water systems, underfunded schools, because wealth concentrated privately doesn't fund public goods. It funds yachts, and yachts don't win wars. Zakat was never designed as military strategy. It was designed as social equilibrium. Prevent extreme poverty, prevent extreme wealth, keep the system balanced, but balance creates resilience, and resilience wins asymmetric wars. Because asymmetric war isn't about who has more, it's about who can sustain longer. And sustainability favors distributed systems over concentrated ones. Iran's economy isn't perfect. Corruption exists. Inefficiency exists. But the foundational principle, mandatory redistribution, creates a baseline resilience that sanctions can't fully break. When $200,000 missiles keep launching, it's not because Iran is wealthier than America. It's because Iran's wealth doesn't sit idle. It circulates, and circulation funds production. The historical parallel is striking. During Islam's golden age, zakat helped fund the libraries, observatories, and hospitals that defined the civilization. Wealthy merchants paid 2.5% annually. That money built institutions. And those institutions produced the scholars who preserved Greek philosophy, advanced mathematics, and pioneered medicine. The system worked because wealth didn't stagnate. It moved. Baghdad's House of Wisdom wasn't built by state taxation alone. It was built by redistributed wealth. Cordoba's libraries weren't funded by conquest. They were funded by circulation. When merchants paid zakat, they funded the infrastructure that made their civilization dominant, not militarily dominant, intellectually dominant, and intellectual dominance lasted longer than any empire. The principle scales. Whether funding hospitals in the 9th century or funding missile production in the 21st, the mechanic is identical. Prevent hoarding, enforce circulation, use redistributed wealth to build capacity, and capacity, whether intellectual or military, determines survival. In 2026, the same principle is playing out in warfare. Zakat-influenced economic culture discourages hoarding, encourages circulation, and circulation funds the domestic production that sanctions were supposed to destroy. Iran builds drones domestically, missiles domestically, defense systems domestically, not because it's technologically superior, but because its economic structure incentivizes local production over import dependence. America's defense industry, by contrast, is concentrated. 5 corporations dominate: Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop, General Dynamics. They optimize for profit, not cost effectiveness, not rapid production. Profit. And profit maximization in a monopolized industry produces expensive, slow-to-build systems. The F-35 program cost $1.7 trillion. Iran's entire military budget for a decade is a fraction of that. Zakat's 2.5% rule seems small, but compounded annually, it's revolutionary. It prevents dynastic wealth. In capitalism, fortunes pass through generations, growing exponentially. In a zakat-based system, fortunes erode unless actively reinvested. That forces capital into productive use, and productive use strengthens the economy. Now apply that to war financing. America borrows to sustain war. Debt grows. Interest compounds. Future generations pay. Iran redistributes to sustain war. Wealth circulates. Production continues. Current generation bears the cost, but also builds the capacity. One system delays pain, the other distributes it. And distributed pain is more sustainable than delayed pain, because delayed pain eventually arrives, and when it does, it arrives all at once. The math is brutal. America's $33 trillion debt costs $600 billion annually in interest alone. That's $600 billion not spent on weapons, infrastructure, or defense, just interest to creditors. Meanwhile, every new war expenditure adds to that debt, and every addition increases future interest. The spiral tightens. Iran's model doesn't spiral. It redistributes from current wealth. No interest, no compounding, no future obligation. The cost is immediate, but immediate costs are manageable. Deferred costs become catastrophic. The 2008 financial crisis proved this. Decades of debt accumulation collapsed in months. Trillions evaporated. Bailouts followed. More debt. The cycle continued. But the lesson was clear. Systems built on deferred costs eventually face reckoning. Zakat prevents deferral. It extracts cost annually, predictably, manageably. In warfare, predictable costs are sustainable costs. Iran knows what it can afford. America doesn't, because America's costs are borrowed. And borrowed costs grow with interest, compounding, accelerating, until the debt becomes the crisis, not the war. The debt. This is why zakat matters in 2026, not as religious doctrine, as economic architecture. It's a system designed to prevent concentration and enforce circulation. And those two principles, preventing concentration and enforcing circulation, create resilience that debt-based systems can't match. Because debt systems are fragile. They depend on perpetual growth, perpetual creditor confidence, perpetual ability to borrow. Zakat systems are anti-fragile. They assume wealth will concentrate, so they tax it. They assume hoarding will occur, so they penalize it. The system adapts by design, not by crisis management, by structural mandate, and structural mandates outlast crises, because they're not reactive, they're embedded. The modern left talks about wealth taxes. 2%, 5%, targeting billionaires, but enforcement is weak. Loopholes exist, offshore accounts, tax havens. The wealthy dodge, because the system is voluntary. Zakat isn't voluntary, it's religious obligation. And religious obligation, in societies where faith matters, is harder to evade than state taxation. Consider the difference. Elizabeth Warren proposed a 2% wealth tax. It faced immediate legal challenges, constitutional questions, implementation debates, and even if passed, enforcement would depend on IRS capacity, which depends on funding, which depends on political will. Zakat has none of these problems. It's embedded in religious practice. Mosques facilitate collection. Community enforces compliance. The system is decentralized, but universally understood. That's structural advantage. This is the uncomfortable lesson from the 2026 war. The system that mandates redistribution is outlasting the system that permits concentration, not because of moral superiority, because of mechanical advantage. Distributed economies withstand shocks better than concentrated ones. Circulating capital funds production faster than hoarded capital, and production wins wars. If this changed how you see the conflict's economics, share it. Because what's happening isn't just military, it's a test of financial systems. And the test is revealing which structures sustain under pressure: debt or distribution, concentration or circulation, borrowed futures or redistributed presents. The results are being written in missiles, deficits, and endurance. And the lesson is older than most people realize.